Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back once more to the War for BADAB. With the revelation of Lufthuron's sins, his secret back garden project Grow Astartes, without approval or planning permission, the war takes a turn yet again. Though unlike many of the others we have seen, this is one of such severity as to promise to be quite permanent. The tale of the War for BADAB has taken quite a few twists and turns, has it not? Unlike the Siege of Vrax, which was a fairly straightforward affair, this has changed again and again and again over the course of centuries. Even the previous War for Armageddon was a measly 3 conflicts, whereas this is the amalgamation of thousands of smaller battles, smaller wars, and smaller competitions. Everything from the creation of the Warders to the establishment of the autonomous zone under the reign of the Astral Claws, to that reign being handed over to Lufthuron after his predecessor's ill-advised adventures in pursuit of Orc pirates, to the rise of a mini-empire within the autonomous zone, the creation of the Tyrant's Legion, and Huron's ever-growing ambition, which once more proves that the road to damnation is indeed paved with good intentions. Now then, Carab Cullen had been deprived of a handful of options, diplomatically speaking, but at least he had been provided with a great deal of clarity of purpose. This was now a simple war of annihilation, something the Imperium has had quite a lot of experience with over the years. Although the annihilation was, for the time being at least, reserved for the Astral Claws, as the Mantis Warriors and Lamenters were still offered the opportunity to surrender and undergo independent inquisitorial review to determine their part in the heresy. Question was how to bring the heretics to justice. The Astral Claws were expected to number between 3 to maybe 4,000 battle brothers at this time. With the addition of the Lamenters, the Mantis Warriors, and the Tyrant's Legion, that put their military might far outside of the immediate capabilities of Carab Cullen to crush. Though the arrival of the Minotaurs chapter was promising to begin to change that trend. So far, the Loyalist chapters had mostly been somewhat of the subdued type, with the exception of the Firehawks, but they had taken such a beating at the hands of the Astral Claws already as to be rendered little more than a tertiary force in the conflict, and also having been put on the sidelines by Carab Cullen, as he couldn't trust them to not chase away yet further allies, like they had with the Marines errant. The Minotaurs, however, were an entirely different breed of Astartes chapters. They had announced their entry into the war by slaughtering 46,000 Tyrant's Legion garrisoned on a minor mining world of limited strategic importance. They had killed them, seemingly just to demonstrate that they could kill them. They had shown absolutely no mercy whatsoever, bringing the broken bodies of the Tyrant's Legion with them as a sort of tribute to announce their official arrival. They dispatched a single ship to Vengeance Station, bearing emissaries to introduce themselves a bit more properly, and to lay their chapter master's plans out for Carab Cullen. The Minotaur's Asterion Moloch had arrived with his own ideas. Oh, they would perhaps consider the instructions of Carab Cullen, but the emissaries made it very clear that right now the Minotaurs were indefinitely indisposed, reaving through the pale stars, the area inhabited primarily by the Lamenters. The Minotaurs had identified them as a weak point in the secessionists' defences, and as a part of prying it open, they had begun to decimate and destroy various strategic targets, according to their own designations. They would attack a world, burn it, and slaughter its populace, ruining any and all industrial machinery and burning agricultural fields to cinders. The Minotaurs were not here to wage a war of conquest. They were not here to wage an imperial civil war, where both sides were imperial citizens. One was merely more misguided than the other. Oh no. The Minotaurs had arrived to deal with heretics, to deal with traitors and secessionists. They were not taking worlds, they were depriving the enemy of worlds. Not to the full extent of Exterminatus, mind, but any planet caught beneath the Minotaur's hooves would require centuries, if not millennia, to recover. Carab Cullen undoubtedly viewed their arrival with somewhat mixed feelings. On the one hand, the Minotaurs were a vital addition to his arsenal, both in terms of sheer battle brothers and numbers, but also due to their specialization, being the complete destruction of enemy strongholds. They were well equipped in strike cruisers, battle barges, and landing capabilities, Thunderhawks, drop pods, and heavy armor, land raiders, vindicators, and siege artillery aplenty. There were very few nuts the Minotaurs were not accustomed to cracking. But on the other hand, they were also one of those chapters who were, as the Inquisition might style it, uncooperative. And their rampages through the Pale Stars not only saw them strike out against secessionist worlds, but also those who had remained independent, either by simply being overlooked by the secessionists as not all that important, and even the worlds, tiny though they might be, minor outposts, watch stations, mining rigs, etc., that had maintained their faith with the Imperium via staying loyal to Carthage, even they were gored by the indiscriminate horns of the Minotaurs. And lest there be any misunderstandings here, by the way, the Minotaurs are not a berserk chapter. They're not blood-crazed maniacs running towards the enemy, frothing at the mouth, screaming. It's not a lack of discipline that sees them doing this. It's not a lack of intelligence or understanding. They could request updated maps from Vengeance Station. They could request counts of neutral systems, of those who had remained loyal. They had the information, or at the very least, they could have requested it. And it's not that they didn't care either. No. This was a very deliberate strategy. They were fighting fellow Space Marines, and the Minotaurs knew damn well just how resilient such a foe could be, you know, being Astartes themselves, and they were not about to allow them any sort of respite, any potential safe harbors, any ways to even hope to resupply themselves. They wanted to make sure that the Lamenters had no way out. They wished to deprive them of any and all means of continuing to resist. Because at the end of the day, the only good war is a war won swiftly and comprehensively. But there was to be an obstacle to stand in between this most worthy objective and the Minotaurs. The Pale Stars had seen more than its fair share of fighting so far in the secessionist civil war. The Lamenters had taken a ferocious beating, as is their lot in the war up until this point. And the Tyrant's Legion, whilst fighting bravely, had no real chance against a chapter as ferocious as the Minotaurs. They had been able to put up a worthwhile resistance against the Red Scorpions due to their prepared positions, and the fact that the Scorpions still had some scruples left in them. The Minotaurs were possessed of no such weakness, and the Lamenters, again, they were certainly going to fight, bravely at that, but their numbers were dwindling swiftly. There was one force in the secessionist camp, however, that was not only willing and capable of standing up to the Minotaurs, but absolutely overjoyed to do so. The Executioners. Oh boy, they had found like-minded individuals they had in the Minotaurs. Two ruthless, scrupulous chapters willing to do anything it took to secure victory for what they perceived to be the right cause. And also two chapters that got superhuman stiffies at the thought of bashing one another bloody with heavy blunt objects. Like two irresistible whirlwinds of sheer undiluted violence, the Minotaurs and the Executioners tore chunks out of each other in dozens of fleet engagements, in hundreds of skirmishes and battles all across the Pale Stars. And the poor bastards who had the deeply undesirable privilege of watching it all unfold would later say that it looked like no thing in the whole wide world, but that the two were loving every single last moment of it. But even the Executioners were busy with other things. And so the Minotaurs were able to make steady progress into the autonomous zone. Their primary and most beloved target were Tyrant's Legion garrison forces, which they were able to attack and annihilate completely. They also usually indicated that a system or a world had a little bit more in the way of strategic value to the secessionists. Not that that necessarily was a absolute necessity for the Minotaurs to attack a world. As mentioned, they were engaged as much in resource denial and terror tactics as they were the destruction of actual targets of importance. Over the course of a little over a year or so of rampaging through the Pale Stars, the Minotaurs reduced the human population of the sector by more than 20%. We do not know the exact population density of the Pale Stars. It was a frontier area after all, so it was unlikely to be that heavily populated, at least by Imperial standards. But it seems quite reasonable to assume that we are looking at a number well and truly into the billions here. I imagine Carab Cullen was not necessarily pleased by this fact either. His Red Scorpions, the Salamanders, the other chapters in general were far more surgical tools than the Butcher's Cleaver of the Minotaurs. But the Minotaurs didn't actually give too much of a shit as to what Carab Cullen did or did not want. They did have a representative at Vengeance Station, Chaplain Enkumi, but he never once offered even so much as a single word of input or advice in any meeting on Vengeance Station. And whilst the Minotaurs were technically speaking under the command of Carab Cullen, you know, they kept themselves quite separate of that command structure. Whenever any instructions were actually sent to them, the Minotaurs would either plead ignorance or simply interpret the order in such a way as to align with their previous plans already. It seemed that the only Imperial authority that had any bearing on the Minotaurs' actions whatsoever was that of Legate Inquisitor Jarndyce Frayne. Oh, they listened to him, but nobody else. That might explain the massive casualty numbers, as the Inquisition is well known for cutting just a little bit extra deep to carve out the corruption they see. But their somewhat bloodthirsty methods notwithstanding, the Minotaurs were absolutely having an effect. By the end of 907, the tyrant's seemingly unassailable defensive position was beginning to crumble at the edges. He was pulling his forces back into the center of the autonomous zone, no longer trying to expand or hold the outer areas. This, amongst other things, resulted in the final fall of Viania. The tyrant had already evacuated most of the Astral Claws and his tyrant's legion forces, but he had left some behind to hold the world for as long as possible, before they too would eventually be pulled out. But before that could be achieved, the Red Scorpions, along with the Minotaurs, launched a surprise night action against Viania, catching the remnants of the Tyrant's Legion still left on the planet by almost complete surprise, turning the entire world into a massive sea of flames in the middle of the night. Butchering what little remained of military forces, they finally took control of the planet that had earned the Tyrant's Legion such a fearsome reputation. And the Loyalists were in no mood to be merciful after all that. All Tyrant's Legion personnel that had surrendered or been otherwise captured during the battle were universally executed the day after, the Red Scorpions making no objections. It would have been normal if it had been the Minotaurs, but to see Carab Cullen's more honourable lot fall to this level of bloodshed as well, the Tyrant's Legion must really have pissed them off. But hey, considering they were merely human auxiliary troops and that they had held this system for years now against Loyalist Astartes' efforts, you kinda gotta understand it, don't you? The mere mortals had insulted the demigod's honor. They couldn't have that stand, now could they? But Viania was not the only area in which Huron began to cede some ground, pulling back more and more forces to protect the more precious areas of his mini-empire, and in some cases also being forced to do so as well. With the fall of Sorngrad, the northern reaches of secessionist space had become far more precarious, and the Galen system, which the Loyalists had just barely been able to hold onto, now saw a rather interesting occurrence happen to it. A force of Astral Claws were fighting against Salamanders and Fire Angels, when suddenly they were assaulted by a third party. Not Imperial, not Secessionists, nor were they Astartes or Imperial Guard, Renegade, Chaos, Marauders, or Pirates. No, they were simply the people of Galen, trying to get their independence back. A group of local aristocrats and nobles had financed an uprising, armed it, and directed against what they viewed as the invaders. Mighty bold of them. The ultimate prize, of course, was the perceived independence from both the tyrants, secessionists, and the Imperium, bearing in mind again that many of the worlds in the Autonomous Zone were de facto independent. They merely paid tribute to the Imperium. Maybe the people of Galen sought a return to those times, or even possibly full independence, unaware of the sheer scale of the creature they were now pissing all over. it ended poorly for them. The sudden intervention of a third party threw the conflict into chaos and confusion for a while, allowing the Astral Claws to disengage relatively easily and exit Galen, now figuring that it would be far better to leave it to the loyalists. Let them fight for this world and take the measures necessary to crush the rebellion. And crush it they most assuredly did. There was no mercy anymore in the Loyalists. Mayhaps before the revelation of Huron's sins, they would at the very least have entertained the possibility of allowing Galen some sort of independence, but no more. Absolutely no more. The poor rebels were exterminated with a ferocity and brutality that the secessionists themselves would have been mighty proud of. And the bad news didn't even stop there for the secessionists. Having lost considerable territory near Galen, having lost Viania, and having lost control of large areas of the Pale Stars, Signax was now next up on the chopping block. The secessionists had maintained a loose control of the area surrounding the now dead world of Signax. They had also been carrying out some excavation operations in cooperation with local tech heretics. At least that is what the Inquisition dubbed them. In all due likelihood, they were simply Adeptus Mechanicus adepts who had sided with the secessionists, either because they had received no other orders from Mars, or because they had found beneficial employment, shall we say. Regardless, they had been trying to find and salvage whatever weapons and technology they could from the now dead world of Signax, and it had been a relatively profitable pickings as well. But the system was not overly valuable, and what remained of it had been much reduced, since it had been the primary battleground between the Astral Claws and the Firehawks, neither side being too gentle with the local environment. Nevertheless, there were still potentially dangerous weapons left on Signax, and even worse, no one really knew quite what was left still on Signax. So the Inquisition in particular had a vested interest in making sure that the secessionists were no longer allowed easy access to it. And as luck would have it, 2 new recently arrived Loyalist chapters could be diverted to the area. The first of these chapters was the Sons of Medusa. A rather interesting one this, as the name suggests it is a successor chapter of the Iron Hands, though technically speaking it's not actually a successor chapter at all, as it was never founded from the Iron Hands or any of their successors, nor is it ruled by a chapter master. Instead, it is controlled by a council of 3 so-called Iron Thanes. The chapter does abide by the rules of the Codex Astartes, as much as any Iron Hands chapter ever does, but you may be noticing that I mentioned it was never actually founded. I believe this chapter is almost unique in this regard, in that it was actually created from an internal agreement within the Iron Hands chapter to separate a portion of the chapter outside of it via, well, a form of exile, almost. It happened during a period of deep disagreement within the Adeptus Mechanicus, known as the Moirae Schism, during which a portion of the Iron Hands, always having had tight bonds to the Mechanicus, decided on a rather different approach to the worship of the God Emperor and the interpretation of the Astronomicon. They believed you could actually see the future in the minute frequential changes in the Astronomicon's beacon. Instead of risking an internal chapter civil war, an agreement was formed with those who wished to follow this new direction, were allowed to leave, whilst being required to sign an official treaty stating that they would never take up arms against the Iron Hands themselves. Over the years, the initial couple hundred brothers then grew into a fully fledged chapter, which is now known as the Sons of Medusa, who had just arrived in the autonomous zone for reasons that they had not chosen to divulge to the rest of the loyalists. But if that was an interesting ally, the second was hardly any less worrying: the Exorcists chapter. Supposedly, they are an Imperial Fist successor chapter, created during the 13th founding. But I am pretty sure that the original color scheme of their legion was not yellow. Probably closer to grey and eventually red than yellow, in fact. The Exorcist is a chapter that is shrouded in secrecy of the highest level. Even the Inquisition is by and large not allowed access to its record, as it was sealed by the inquisitorial representative of the Senatorum Imperialis and then High Lord of Terror. Though we do have some records of them. For example, they are a mostly Codex-compliant chapter, except for the fact that they boast 12 companies, not 10. They have 3 scout companies, and report a casualty ratio of 80% when it comes to elevating a scout to the rank of full battle brother. Now that's harsh. Now that's very harsh. Chapters losing the occasional scout here and there is not unusual, because they are of course used in the front line of the fighting to engage the foe and be hardened into full brother Astartes. But 80%, not just due to the rigors of combat, but 80% due to the elevation to full brother Astartes. A surgery which, by Space Marine standards, is relatively safe. Oh, something is very wrong here. And so as to not torture you too much, well, some Inquisitors are created more equal than others, and the 80% casualty figure, frankly, should probably be way higher than that. Because the final initiation ritual to turn a scout into a full exorcist is not merely the final implementation of the black carapace readying the individual to don his suit of power armor. Oh no. The final initiation ritual sees the scout be possessed by a demon, turning him into a demon host for a period of time, before eventually the monstrous entity is driven from the initiate's body by an inquisitor attached to the exorcists. Hence their name. And again, honestly, a mere 80% fatality rate for such a ritual is, remarkably low. I suppose, if anything, it simply just proves that yes, the exorcists have really deserved their reputation as stellar demon fighters. Now, of course, if this rather peculiar initiation ritual would ever become known to the wider Imperium again, oh, they'd have plenty of Inquisitors knocking on their doors, but not in a cooperative or friendly manner, I imagine. And yet, despite this colourful backstory, the exorcists weren't the problem. No, it was the Sons of Medusa. They were both being dispatched to clear the Signac sector and the planet itself, to remove the Astral Claws and their heretic allies from the world, and secure any tech left behind. And when it comes to long-lost ancient technology, the Iron Hands are almost as sticky-fingered as the Blood Ravens. And so whilst the executioners were busy running around doing what they'd actually been ordered to do, getting rid of the astral claws and their heretic compatriots, securing the planets and actually trying to locate the weaponry and other interesting little doodahs that the Inquisition had told them to look for, the Sons of Medusa were busy looking too, except they weren't handing any of it over. Interestingly enough, the decision was eventually made to withdraw the executioners from the conflict, after they had made quite a lot of dissatisfied, complaining noises in the general direction of Vengeance Station, about how they seemed to be the only ones taking their task seriously. But for some interesting reason, the Sons of Medusa were allowed to stay behind and loot Signax for as long as they wanted. Amusingly enough, further down the road too, they will turn out to be quite cooperative with the Inquisition. What a coincidence. And so, whilst the Sons of Medusa were left to, let's be honest here, loot Signax, the Exorcists were withdrawn in preparations for a major offensive. Carab Cullen had set his eyes on Sagan this time. A massive naval complex that had been seized by Lufthuron after a brilliant diversionary maneuver had led the Firehawks astray, had long been a target of considerable value for the Loyalists. Without Sagan, their routes into the heart of secessionist space were severely limited, and it had been one of the reasons why the Galen system had remained so stubbornly in opposition to the Loyalists, why the operation against Sorengrad had been such a massive risk, and an even greater reason to make seizing Sagan a priority was, of course, its massive orbital dockyards. Keeping a space fleet in fully operational condition is no easy task. They require a great deal of replenishment, refurbishment, maintenance, and supplies to keep both the vessel and its crew in top fighting shape. Of course, some resupply and maintenance can be done whilst the ship is in voyage, but extensive maintenance, proper repairs, and full resupply almost require a naval dockyard. These are warships with massive crews that need to be able to go on extended patrols for months and months and months at a time, if not indeed years. That requires an awful lot of food, of drinking water, and air. Imperial recycling technology is fairly advanced, but there is absolutely some loss that needs to be accounted for. There is also the human factor as well, as a considerable quantity of the crew are essentially slaves and serfs. They tend to experience attrition to a fairly considerable degree, and need frequent resupply. The professional crew as well occasionally require a little bit of R&R, unless they are spacers, void-born people who have never actually stepped foot off their spaceships. This is more usually a result of extended voyages and mercantile vessels rather than Imperial Navy warships, although the highest echelons may not have been off the ship for decades, not indeed centuries. And up until this point, Carab Cullen had been able to make the wheels turn relatively well, within the acceptable parameters. Ships had to go on the occasional extended deployment or hurry back on the day to make sure they get the maintenance they required, but by and large it hadn't been too much of an issue. However, his Imperial Guard forces, his Navy forces, and his own Astartes forces were all growing day by day, and ships were beginning to be asked to stay out for a dangerously long period of time. losing entire warships due to mechanical malfunction. Oh, that's expensive wastage right there. And if Cullen was ever intending to launch a full-scale operation towards BADAB Primaris, he was going to need every ship he had, and therefore the capabilities to actually maintain and keep them operational. This fact was obviously recognized by the Tyrant as well, and whilst he was pulling back on most fronts, Sagan would remain defiant with a sizable Astral Claws garrison and considerable Tyrant's Legion forces. Sagan was to either be held at all costs or be rendered completely unusable by the loyalists. And to ensure that, just in case military might alone was not enough to secure the Sagan system, the Tyrant had put in place a little surprise for the loyalists, to ensure at the very least that any offensive towards Sagan would not have any victors. But to figure out what that surprise is going to be, you're going to have to wait until next week again, but I assure you, it's going to be an explosive episode up next. Until then, I have been Art. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.